Hello. So this afternoon, what I would like to do, if it's okay, is discuss a little bit around authority in Zen and back up and do a little historical presentation. Then out of that, hopefully we can thrash through what we tend to understand authority is and why we have it, and what it is and what it isn't, and what questions might arise out of the broad historical perspective on our understanding of authority. And from that, just because I'm giving the talk, a little exploration on or mind game, if not a thought experiment, on what a genuinely democratic community could do with Zen, or Zen with the democratic community, and then move from that into reality and spend the final part discussing, well, what are the options for people who have an egalitarian spirit in a structurally hierarchical organization. Does that sound like it might be fun? Cool. So I realized, what was it, the other, I'm just going to read this. This was my blog entry for June 27th. In the early middle of the 19th century, the brilliant, driven, and sometimes monstrous Samuel Gridley Howe, while director of Perkins School for the Blind, building upon earlier work, particularly the theoretical musings of the philosopher Denis Diderot, and making it his own, discovered the secret of educating the deaf-blind. His first success was Laura Bridgman, a girl from New Hampshire. She, and with her, Dr. Howe and Perkins, became world famous. For a time, Laura was second only to Queen Victoria in her fame. Charles Dickens visited the school and befriended it and Laura, writing of them in his book, American Notes. In later years, she would become one of Annie Sullivan's teachers. This all comes to mind because Helen Keller was born on this day in 1880. This was the 27th. After her tragic illness, her mother, desperate for help, read the American Notes. She wrote to Perkins. They sent her Annie. The rest, as they say, is history. And then I included a little video clip from the water scene in The Miracle Worker. There's something in human affairs that causes us to be interested in lineage. You know, we want to know where we come from, and we naturally, I think, tend to attribute our inspirations as they go back, and we're fascinated by where things, how things are related to one another. At least that's my thesis. Now, when Gautama Siddhartha had his great insights and proclaimed them for 40-odd years, when he lay there on his side, coughing up his last, he was asked, who will succeed? What he said was, the Sangha succeeds, and by which he meant the ordained Sangha, 4 monks or nuns. And the whole idea of a direct lineage from Gautama Siddhartha to anyone is sort of contradicted by that assertion, which is counted in all the canonical accounts, both in the Nikayas and the Agamas. Both the Pali and the Sanskrit texts concur that he did not name an heir. So, what do we have? Zen emerges in early medieval China. It isn't hard to look at it and see absolutely it's Buddhism, and absolutely it is Buddhism that has been washed through Chinese culture, particularly Taoism, and a little bit more than a splash of Confucius. And as this new, this rapidly hybridizing tradition presented itself, people say, well, where do you come from? And this is a cultural context that not only has the regular human desire to know, where we come from, who are our ancestors, but whose whole cultural matrix demanded that you belong to a family. We want to know who your father is, and who his father was. And I think it's father. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that seemed to be the big focus. And they said, well, and I don't know how they picked Bodhidharma, but Bodhidharma got nominated, and then Bodhidharma didn't just appear out of nowhere. He comes from India. He has a whole succession of, 28 ancestors back to Gautama Siddhartha. In our koan literature, in the Harada-Yasutani tradition, part of Daiyun Harada's reform as a Soto master who studied in the Rinzai tradition, when he started creating a curriculum that he felt respected the Soto line as much as the Rinzai line, he adopted a couple of Soto books to be part of the koan literature. One, the Book of Equanimity, is a powerful, beautiful koan collection. It ranks right there with the Euclid record for literary merit, and just it's a gorgeous book, and it's really an easy. It slips so easily into the curriculum, no problem. And he picked Keizan's Transmission of the Lamp. And that's simply another lamp history, the biographies of the Inlet Masters in line forward. And for him, that meant from Gautama Siddhartha to Acha. And so through Dogen, and then to his successor, stopping just ahead of Keizan because he was being modest. What's fascinating is the Chinese accounts are all perfectly fine koan. The Indian stories suck as koan. And the problem is for the most part, it's like, and he realized the validity of his past lives and was enlightened. Now, you could make pretty much anything in koan. But let me tell you, that one requires a little work. And part of the problem was, setting aside the fact, well, not even setting aside the fact, you look at the names are simply the most prominent Indian Buddhists arranged kind of in chronological order. So all the greats are there, happen to be our ancestors. And you can see the cut and paste. They really took another tradition, which they legitimately, owed a great deal to. Nagarjuna is critical to us. Vasubandhu is somebody important to us, but more as a literary ancestor, not as our actual tactile. He taught him, taught him, taught him. That happens in China, and probably if you look at it, the first time we can be confident there is actually an ancestor who is going to create the historical lineage that we do inherit. I would guess it's Hongren. It's Hui Nung's teacher, Because Hongren is a clear, unambiguous historical figure. He's teaching a kind of something that looks like Shikantaza, largely. He's drawing upon a few earlier sources that do, that fit, but the rest of the four ancestors before that, it's kind of maybe, I'm not saying it doesn't go back one or two more generations, but who knows for sure. It's a sea in which people are visiting, there are other kinds of teachers, contending philosophies within this emerging Chinese Buddhism are all jostling up against each other, and they're learning and they're challenging, and things are happening. It's a very juicy period. But we don't get a historical transmission until, with certainty, until we get to Hongren. Why is that important? I would say if we actually went back to a secret teaching of Gautama Siddhartha twirling the flower and Mahakashyapa smiling at the wonder of it all, well, then we have to contend with this, with an assertion about reality, that we are in fact in some kind of tactile succession where it's, if not magical, it is close enough, that without it you're not real, and with it you're the Buddha. And it doesn't start there. It starts in the Middle Ages. It dates back to the 9th century. Now, that's a fucking long time. That means something. I mean, it is valorized by having survived that way, with an occasional tweak and a question or two. The whole, the whole Soto line requires somebody in a Lin G line being assigned to be, who has multiple transmissions, to give one to somebody, which is kind of, makes no sense on the face of it. But the successions continue, and there are, they all are there. Similarly, just to underscore that it is not magic, Hakuin Ikaku, who is like super important to me, even though he's not my lineage, he never received formal Dharma transmission. He was fully ordained. He trained with his master. It's really clear who his teacher was. He never received, the portrait or in the symbols of that time. But even in his day, he was considered a Dharma heir of the teacher, lacking the ceremonial stuff, just because of the quality of his teachings and the context in which he presented himself. He did not invent his position; it was there, but there was no document that was passed on. There was no ceremony in which his teacher. Shojin. Yeah, doesn't matter. It's when we start looking at this, what we start seeing is something enormously powerful being occurring, but it isn't magic. Rather, it is a family of teachings, a family of practices, and that larger community, that sangha that supports it and pushes it forward, is in many ways more important than any given individual within the sangha. I think in contemporary times in North America, the example of Philip Kapleau enormously important and potentially liberating for us. Philip Kaplow completed half of the koan training before he and his teacher had their fight and broke up at the very beginning of modern Western Zen. And he began teaching independently with no author, with a very limited authorization. Nobody has ever claimed it to be anything more than being allowed to start a center and give interviews with people. He trained up a dozen people that are universally acknowledged as first-rate Zen teachers. They were incorporated into the foundings of the American Zen Teachers Association. They are acknowledged by Zen teachers as Zen teachers. And I think that aspect of transmission is really interesting, rich, and potentially important for us. That I would say ideally you have that vertical transmission. I think it's a deeply important symbol. But as important is the horizontal transmission, the fact that your peers see you as a teacher, and it can heal many wounds. It can give us much to work with. The problem with Zen transmission is being magic, as being this thing that comes from an unbroken line, is that with that one story comes a cluster of other stories. And then all of a sudden, one's realization is world transforming. Again, it is identical with Gautama Siddhartha's realization. It is very similar to the structures that you see in the Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodoxy, in which the bishops bishops were made by bishops who were made by bishops who were made by the apostles who were made by Jesus himself. The authority becomes unassailable, and what they say is Christ's teachings. If we take a more historical view, we can embrace something that looks a tiny bit more like Anglicanism. One of my professors at seminary said that in the Episcopal Church, really, the apostolic succession, as they call their line of bishops, is much less hands to head, which is the style in which they're created, but rather bust chairs. You occupy the same office that your predecessor occupied. And it may not be quite as mystically satisfying, but it speaks to a practicality. We have walked into, we came out of a tradition in which the first wave of teachers, missionaries, and a few Americans who went to, Westerners who went to Japan, I'm thinking primarily of, but it's also true of China and Korea. If we pull back and we start looking at that first wave of teachers, all of them, if they left Japan, it meant they were marginal people in some way. A well-adjusted Japanese does not leave Japan. The people who came here were eccentric in some manner. They were rule breakers. Now, we got a lot of good out of that, from this crowd, but we also inherited this literature of a valorized poet, and where if you were awake, you were like an ordinary human being. Your shit didn't stink, which reminds me, we need a plunger.
Note to self. Shit, overwhelming. Talk about practical.
Practical, yeah. And this simpler, more real approach allows us to look at our teachers enormously grateful. I mean, these people, we were talking about geokinetic, sex is not the only way you can be abusive, let me tell you. And my debt to Kenneth Roshi is endless. She opened the way for me. She acknowledged certain things in my life that have set the course that I can now testify 40 years later were actually transformed. Each of the founding teachers brought great gifts, and they were human beings, and where we saw it really break down is around sexual ethics, and I don't want to go just we could spend the rest of our lives discussing the nature of sexual ethics, what are appropriate, what are boundaries, well, is this person's sin as bad as that person's sin? I think what we can say is they absolutely were in varying degrees caught up in varying issues because they were human beings and not some transformed individual. They were people who had varying degrees. I think most of them had really deep insights, and many of them were enormously skillful teachers, and together as a batch they brought something powerful and worthy to this country. We have inherited the blessings and the mess, and I don't think we can fix the mess if we pretend that realization is enough. That the insight is the summa of our experience. Instead, it turns out it is perhaps a keystone to a full life, a genuine integration into the world that really is. But it requires a whole bunch of other steps. I go back and I think specifically, I think I mentioned how it seemed to me that Zen originally in North America was like going to a gym. It was all about meditation and the ethical concerns, and even actually a real investigation of awakening was subsumed in a cult of Zazen and the cult of the teacher. We took Roshis and made them gurus, which turned out to be a mistake. So I guess that's kind of my basic thesis. Do we want to challenge it, unpack, go through any parts of that aspect?
Just one point, when you said realization is not enough, we would also include transmission and the meaning of transmission.
Right.
And maybe you're going to go on.
Yeah, I will absolutely go into its practical applications of what we would do.
I want to unpack something because historical that I feel is going to be a concern now. And that you mentioned the 9th century, so I assume you're referring somewhat to the 845 persecution of Buddhism in China to some degree, and how the monasteries got broken up, and then all of these different lineages had to compete for congregants, and so they all wanted to be the authentic lineage. So that's already a problem, and now I feel like it might be repeating itself because there's so many branches out, competing branches out, and Zen centers opening up all over the place.
Yeah, I wouldn't reduce it to economics. Although I'm sure that's an element of it, but contending, as near as I can tell, and I'm not a historian, that in the Ming period, they took the myths that were, the hagiographies, not myths, but hagiographies that were composed in in the Sung, which, am I getting my order right, that turned on real human beings from the Tang. Is that, do I have my order?
Yeah.
My order right? Yeah, and so, and the Sun, which is, you know, which is where we're seeing this, you know, this enormous cultural chaos, there was definitely contending stuff going on, and I don't feel comfortable saying, and it has to do with having enough adherence to support yourself. I think people actually had salvific paths and which was and they really were contending because they really believed they found the best way. Is how I would just hesitate to put an economic interpretation on what happened.
So I don't know if I want to challenge this, I think, but I'd like some more clarity around what the statement is of concern about Roshi's being treated as gurus. I think you put it, or then shorthanded since maybe later about cult, making it into a cult, you know, worshiping as Roshi.
Right.
Would you expand on that a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a variety of, I mean, everybody's got their personalities. Aiken Roshi is a very interesting figure because he's the only, right off the top of my head, the only one who didn't have an actual scandal attached to him from that generation of teachers. And as people who knew him said, well, that's because he was so inhibited that he never had the intestinal fortitude to act upon his longings. So, which I find kind of interesting aside. Also, he in some ways, because he's an American, he is already somewhat suspect for the guru-ness, because I don't want to call it racism, but there was projections.
The exotic.
We were making these teachers more than they were, and we were. It was a co-conspiracy. The literature itself, talks about these transformative experiences and how you wake up and you're perfect. Everything you do is and took living into it for us to discover this is like really important stuff. Getcho is powerful, and it doesn't. The real path is actually a spiral. We keep revisiting our stuff, and I don't think we ever. If we're composed, if the fundamental teaching is that we are, the products of conditions. Well, the conditions change, so the product changes a little bit, but it's still, most of it's, it's a great package. We're going to be desirous or angry or, whatever it is that we are. But the literature suggests otherwise. It implies this transformative quality. And we, in our culture in the 60s and 70s, when this wave that becomes contemporary Zen happened, so we take somebody like Sasaki Roshi, who is clearly competent. He is an actual Roshi in the Japanese Rinzai tradition, which is a fierce and training path that takes 30 and 40 years to go to achieve that title. And he had whatever else that happened to him and in his life that were shortcomings. That was true. He was a competent Rinzai master. In Japan, he's one of a couple of thousand, and if he does wrongdoing within their cultural context, they deal with it, or not, as they thought, as they feel appropriate. He comes to America, and all of a sudden he's the guru. And since almost all Zen teachers are the only true Zen teacher, in my observation. Other Zen teachers may be real, but when we talk privately, I can tell you, why they're not really quite up to snuff. Saki Roshi was even more of that than many of the others. If you didn't, if he did something you didn't like, well, if you left him, you left Zen. And people have made light of the fact that when he was first here, he gave a talk in Berkeley, and somebody said, "This is really wonderful. Is there any Zen in the Bay Area?" And he said, "No." His assistants, scurried to explain that he meant in the Rinzai school, not the fact that Shunryu Suzuki was teaching across the water and had a very large center. I don't think he meant that. I think he meant, no, there's no Zen here. Yeah. And in varying degree, all the other teachers did this as well. And so there's this kind of, you leave, at the very beginning, I'm working with Jude Kennett in, 1969. And it was clear to me, if I left Jude Kennett, that was the end of Zen. I'm pretty sure that's true for many teachers. Not all of them, but many. And it wasn't even necessarily what the teachers did. It's what this, it's a co-conspiracy. We were all caught up in it, and that's.
And there weren't very many teachers.
And there weren't very many teachers. There were about 5 or 6.
But I'd like to address the heart of this, of what it means, what a guru is.
Yeah.
Compare it to what my understanding, where that may overlap with what a Roshi is or not.
Right.
Because,
Well, it's an interesting
because
one.
to use that term, I have heard it, not just in this particular context, but in other contexts thrown around in casual conversation as if all gurus were somehow suspect, inherently suspect. That in that term lies something rotten that we should all be suspicious of, and it's not, that term has become kind of a pejorative.
Right.
I'm not saying, so I want to caution, I feel cautionary about that habit we're developing in American culture, and to say that I think it would help us all as we try to deal with these issues, as we must, I think, to get really clear about what is how the guru-student relationship functions. What do you mean by that? What is that?
So I don't think
what is the point
right.
of that in a relationship with people who are on the kind of spiritual training that it has this kind of depth and requires that you untether yourself from your assumptions in order to move forward. That there is a danger zone in this work, I believe.
Absolutely, if I may. I don't want to get dragged off into a discussion of Hindu theology. But and I can do that.
Okay, great.
The reason the word guru becomes a good touchstone for us as Zen Buddhists, and to challenge what it is that we have received as teaching, is that in classic Hinduism, the individual who achieves God consciousness is God, and the guru is God, and it's an interesting path, and I do have judgments on it, but it's a choice that people make. People attracted to Zen Buddhism at the front end may have thought teachers were gurus, in that Zen teachers were gurus, in that sense that maybe we didn't call it God, but it was, but it was the Buddha.
I think we need to take a couple minutes because it's also very much part of the Tibetan tradition. And you make those guru vows in Buddhism.
And I do have judgments on that. I am that, as a Zen Buddhist, one of the reasons I am a Zen Buddhist today even as, you know, as opposed to why I was a Zen Buddhist 45 years ago, is that I see this path is a path of humanity, and that nobody's realization transforms them from being an ordinary human being subject to all the foibles of being human.
It's the fox koan.
It's the fox koan.
Yes, it is the fox koan.
And the Roshi is not, the enlightened person is bound by the laws of cause and effect. The enlightened person is one with the law of cause and effect. And I don't want to try to unpack Hindu concepts of whether a guru is.
No, I didn't mean that, but I did mean that when you go to a Roshi in that in a koan practice, and the atmosphere that you're describing, that you inherited from Japan, the formality and the way that environment is established with that teacher has an element of a legitimate, I believe, element of the guru formula.
You know, actually, right, I actually
That's
think,
my question.
I think it is not necessary.
I agree with you,
I-
and I
yeah.
have to say some things about it.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay, well, I mean, now, I don't want to say that stylized relationship, you know, building the archetypes, having a completely cloistered teacher, and having your relationship, you know, really focused in these moments where art is not valuable. I
It's
think,
not valuable.
no, I'm not saying that is not
Oh,
valuable.
oh.
Yeah, how's that for a quadruple thing there? Yeah. So I think it can be a very, it has worked in Japan and Korea. It really isn't like that in China, as near as I can tell. But it need not be. You can have a full koan experience of awakening without that context. I can testify to that. I've witnessed it. And I think, you know, I'm a 100 flowers person. I think there's a place, I hope that Rinzai-ji survives as an institution, and I would, you know, actually I would, because actually they don't transmit the koan curriculum, so I'm not sure what that actually means for them. But let's say Edo Shimano's crowd, they do transmit the koan curriculum, and I think it's really valuable, and I hope they can get through their travails in some manner intact. I'm less concerned about the survival of their specific buildings, as beautiful as they might be. I want to see teaching lineages survive, and at least with Roko, it looks like it's, you know, they do it kind of classically. I mean, there really is something of that very formalized style. I think less with Genjo Marinello. He seems to be, you know, he's contaminated by the Quakers. So there is a little bit more egalitarian style there, and I know that works too. I mean, I know you don't have to have a heavy projection on the teacher in order for it
I'm
to
not
work.
really saying that you have to,
Yeah.
but that having that has a function.
It absolutely has a function.
That's all I meant.
Yeah.
I didn't mean you have to have it.
Right.
But that it's not evil in and of itself.
It's not evil. It's not
It
evil.
has a function, and for
Right.
some people, that helps create this experience that allows for the tension to move.
Evil,
Not everybody.
evil only enters in if people think it has to be that way.
Well, that's another issue.
Well, and
We're
that's the issue,
examining
and this is the issue that I'm concerned with. I'm more than happy to stipulate that classic training models are fine. And I'm more interested in what's going to happen now, because we've seen what the problems with those training models are when they've encountered our culture and people's assumptions, everybody's assumptions, allows us to walk into, you know, trouble. You know, not once, not twice, but, you know.
Many times, it's not the exception.
Right. It's not the exception. It tends to be, and I think part of the offense for many people is that we set ourselves up.
That's right, we were co-conspirators.
We were all involved, and
So that's the human being.
this is the human
Well,
being.
I want to say more about this
Sure.
culturally, because first of all, guru is a foreign term. We do not have gurus, except as we create them in this culture, you know, Deepak Chopra or something like this. We do not have gurus here. We've adopted the word. We do not understand what it means. Now, and to say that the model that came over, for example, with Sasaki, let's just say that is one example, is a model of classical relationship in Japan is just not true. People in Japan do not relate to their teachers, in my experience, the way that community related to him. People in Japan see a priest as a bald-headed rascal until proven otherwise, and do not put him on some throne. And as soon as there's something wrong, there's a whole community of teachers who are going to come forward, and somebody's going to call him out and talk to him. So the idea that the classical model in Japan is what we got over here is just not true. It is our doing, as you say. We were co-conspirators. I think in the human psyche, as Diane showed us, there are places on the wheel where we want to have someone who has power much more so than any normal human being. That is our own weakness. And we project that, and we've created this issue. And in Tibet and in places where they have gurus, it is no end to trouble. And this part of what's going on in Tibet right now, which was ripe for revolution, and Trungpa said it was corrupt. It was corrupted. But what we have in Japan is a teacher and a disciple, or an apprenticeship model. That is different than a guru model. An apprenticeship is different. And I think the problem with the guru discipleship, first of all, we have no context for it, as they do in India and other countries where they have gurus. And there are many, many warnings about gurus in India. Wherever you go, there are many warnings. We have no warnings. We thought they were from heaven. But the biggest problem in my mind, and I do say, I won't say it's inherently evil because nothing has substantial self, but I will say the potential for danger in that kind of relationship, because we abdicate our own self, emotional intelligence, common sense. We abdicate that when we turn ourselves over to this higher power, and there is very big danger in doing that. And it has, in my view, it is not the classical model from Japan. It is not what we got. What we got was our own schmozzle. We got our own mess. We got our own mess of a commune, of hippies looking for higher consciousness, of putting an archetype, as we did with the Charles Manson group and the others, who were the ones that... James Jones. We had all that come together in our Zen life, and I don't think it has that much to do with the classic models from Japan.
Is it a question of, this was something that somebody brought to my attention along the way, the question of submission to the teacher versus to the practice. Being able to make the, being able to, the practice containing both.
Right. Yeah, well, I think as we go forward, and I think what you see if you look at a larger cultural context, I mean, when a tradition takes root, there are multiply redundant protections, and I think bowing to the teacher, as I mean, the Benedictine order, the abbot stands in the place of God, and good things and bad things have happened out of the Benedictine order. It is but it is a pattern, and I think what we're going to see in, like I said, I believe we're facing a big die-off. That whatever our actual hard numbers of Zen Zen Buddhist practice in North America is going to shrink by some significant factor with the loss of the boomers. And the
Boomers.
boomers.
Oh.
And the X have not been a very large, but there was a point when I thought this really was a historical political, that we were, that my generation was it, and it would peter out. The Xers did not come in any significant numbers. The millennials seem to have become a game changer. It's too early to be sure where this is going to go, but I now believe there will be Zen in 50 years in North America. What I don't know is what it's going to look like. There are 100 flowers. I mean, this is we're coming. I believe we're tailing in. I think Grace and I are slightly in disagreement about this. I think we're coming to the end of the scandals as a big thing, and that we're going to have fewer charismatic teachers. We're going to have more boring teachers, and we'll probably be a little healthier for that. And we need those charismatics. We need visionaries. We need people who really challenge the status quo. But I think we'll have better protections for people, for the teachers as well as for us, because it will be more culturally ingrained. It will have become adapted to our culture in a more organic and natural way, I suspect.
And they'll have another set of problems.
And they'll have their own problems, and it'll be, but they, our obligation at this point, I think, is the number one, tend to our own practice, not forget that, and the number two, look out for our neighbors, and see what it is that how can we witness to a healthier approach to this for our culture.
And that's, in my opinion, it's not even separate. Focusing on my practice and the world.
That's because you took those bodhisattva vows.
Yeah, right.
He is about to. But I want to go back to your word, submission, because I know John Wellwood and Barry Madge just picked it up without quoting him, but John Wellwood said first, it's surrender versus submission. And I'm not even sure if using either one is good. And it's certainly not about surrendering or submitting to the teacher. It's about loving the Dharma. And, I'm glad that my students are loyal to me and they see that I have some value in their practice. It's about the Dharma. It's not about me. And, we have to get that straight.
Well, and here's where it gets thorny, because and the Dharma is only grace as well. I mean, so we need to, it's only James. It's only,
I'm
it's
sorry,
only
you're not going back that.
it's only found in the specific. There is no Dharma writ large. The Dharma is what manifests as two people talking, me sitting here. And you can't, there's no realization in the abstract.
I'm not talking about realization, I'm talking about practice.
Well,
The
in fact,
technology
yeah.
of practice is in Zazen, it's in our text, it's in our
Absolutely.
koan curriculum, it's in hearing many teachers speak, it's in listening to your song, that's the Dharma.
It's butts to chairs. It's our finding that cluster of practices, that style of community, and how that specifically is going to take shape. We're in this 100 flowers tree. We're gonna, and we'll move. I think that's where we're going to start when we move from this kind of meta discussion about transmission itself, authority itself, and then into the hypothetical. Well, both the hypotheticals and the emerging practices. What we're seeing happen and where. Well, I'm going to inflict a little bit about what I would kind of like to see, but won't spend a whole lot of time there, and mainly talk about.
But I just wanted to, it seemed by my mind when you said butts to chairs, and I was drawing this the sort of circle of what's going on and needs to happen
Right.
a little bit. Going back to when you talked about this horizontal transmission as this
Right.
term, that by that, you also referring to this, the fact that, as I understand, historically in the lineages, in order to be given a transmission, and you had to go to 4 other Roshis, besides the one, your teacher, and they had to agree that that should happen before it could happen.
Things rarely happen in isolation, though. I think there's a bit of a myth in there. I look at the Quantum School at this point. They're fascinating in that regard. Even though they maintain a line of transmission and the teacher gives authorization to a student, but they have a 2-tier transmission. The first time a teacher says, I think you should teach, that teacher does not have the authority to, by remaining, if they want to remain in the organization, to simply make that person their heir. They have to send them to a set number. I don't know.
My understanding was
3.
not that it was just that school. I thought that the title Roshi came with the stipulation.
I'm confused about the Roshi itself as a term in Japan seems to mean in Soto. We were discussing. We're not even sure it's ever conferred. It's an honorific. Yeah, and in the Rinzai tradition, it follows a specific course of accomplishments. You not only complete the koan curriculum, then you have to, which is the core, of the karate asatani thing, is just the koan curriculum. In addition to the koan curriculum, you have to pass through the cap and phrase collections of your tradition, which, in my opinion, has no spiritual value at all. It's arbitrary lists of literary capping phrases from East Asia attached arbitrarily to specific koans, and that you have to match them. And it takes a very long time. It starts slowing the process down. It takes probably, just to give an average number, about a decade to complete koan, formal koan introspection practice, if you're meeting somebody, every day. Then you have to do that. Then you have to do a series of quasi-academic papers. And then, let's see, there's one more thing. I can't remember what Victor said.
Besides the capping phrase.
And there's one more
Other
actual requirement within the, was it 10 schools of Rinzai Zen, they all do the same basic formula. And you're talking about a process for somebody who's going to get that title, Roshi, that takes 30 to 40 years on average. The end game, whether they have to be, definitely there's some communal connection within the institutions, whether it's formalized as 4 teachers signing on or not.
I've seen that in writing. I'll find.
Well, I mean, it's totally
The point, the
plausible.
only reason I bring that up is the point being, or the point I took, or they took it to represent, is the intention that no one person is to judge this, and no one person is to presume, no matter who they are,
Right.
to have the sensibility to establish the lineage. So it takes 4 others who've had 4 others and so forth, in order to confirm what this one teacher sees to be was possible.
And we're very opposed to that in social.
Yeah, well, and I think, I don't,
Social.
right,
One teacher, one disciple.
right, and I think that's Rinzai too. I think
But
that's a
my
very,
point is not about one teacher, one disciple. It's
Right.
about 4 teachers actually deciding that one can teach, that a student can then teach.
and while that's admirable, I don't think that's the tradition. The myth of our common ancestry is lineage.
That.
It's teacher to student to teacher, student to teacher to teacher to teacher.
I think
And
just given the other stuff you're planning, I just want to
yeah,
say.
I don't want to get too far.
Let's get on with
We are
what we
we
can
are
do.
wandering into the weeds a little bit here.
Yeah.
I think 4 teachers is a great idea. I mean, I think that, I really admire the quantum, and I think that they have because they do it twice. You not only, to get the junior teacher certificate, you have to have been vetted internally by other teachers in the lineage. And then for their senior teaching position, they have them, it's complicated, but there is a certain amount of going even out of their order into meeting with other teachers.
James, would it be fair to say that we probably know less about Rinzai's in here, only because there's far less of the lineage established in the United States?
Right. Absolutely. It is more of a mystery. I found myself trying to when I was writing my history of Zen Buddhism in North America. Walking into Rinzai was very difficult because there's so little of it, and and I missed a whole lineage because they didn't move in mainstream Zen circles.
So is that
Which one?
It's the Omori,
Yeah.
Sogen Omori line. It appears to be a completely legitimate Rinzai line, but they don't join AZPA. They don't move in the circles of the Zen community. They move in the martial arts world.
I don't know, I'm sorry, it just feels, I understand, I mean, I'm here to hear this point, but it's borderline on an offensive way to address this, with two of us sitting in the room who have this training and not in the assumption that because we've been students of a teacher who's impressionable, that no one, it's not legitimate somehow, and in every way it's dismissed, and then to have someone say that is offensive.
I'm sorry, I'm confused as to where I was offensive. Because I certainly don't want to be offensive. I want to unpack.
I don't hesitate because I'm a self not regurgitate.
Well, I think we have to do
3 people or 4 people at the table have dismissed it as mysterious and unavailable after having basically said that Sasaki having added to the fire that's going on around his behavior.
We're not talking about him, we're talking about whether or not some of the stories in the Rinzai school, for example, 4 teachers.
Well,
just a sec.
Yeah.
Whether it's necessary for 4 teachers to confer transmission, and whether that's a myth or not, has nothing to do with
Well, I'm
society.
the only one at the table who said, I will research that. And
Great.
I will. And
Please
I
do,
will,
and let's
and
drop
I
it
will.
there then.
But that's okay. But it didn't get dropped there. So
Okay,
that's
let's
all.
drop it there,
Yeah.
and let's research it, but according to our understandings of history and the single lineage that keeps being presented historically, it doesn't match, but that's okay. We can look into it. It's not that important. What is important is that feelings are activated because there is all this swirling. We're not talking about society, but there is all this swirling. Once we start talking about scandals, no, I understand. But when we're talking about scandals, it's easy to personalize and to think we're dismissing a certain lineage. We're talking about the problem that happened when teachers came over and hippies, drug movement, idealization met.
Yes.
And I have less concern about the individuals who came over than I do about our tendency as human beings to do that and then to take it personally. So what we have to do is get off the wheel that Diane pointed to for us. Once those feelings get activated, it's impossible for us to talk. So anybody whose feelings got activated in this needs to examine those activated feelings and try to get off the wheel and see that it's just we're exchanging ideas.
I think there's another issue here, which is the problem of institutionalization, and these things become politicized, and they become separating, and that's also a natural human thing. And we lose sight of what we're actually trying to do, which is to ease suffering, and just causing more by our putting importance on the functional and sort of reified process of what's going on. So we start paying more attention to that rather than to what's our essential purpose.
Absolutely, and I think that institutions matter. Because I think once once it's more than two people, we've got an institution. And what we've seen is a collapse of our, of Zen in North America. It ain't Sasaki by himself, it's every one of our lineages is marked
by our projection and idealization and expectations. Yeah. And it's collapsed.
Are inflated.
Our inflation has collapsed and collapsed those institutions.
And so what do we do? And that's, I think I've laid it out as best I can. I think I'm pretty accurate.
You want to create a more sustainable model of interacting, and that's what we want to talk
and then
about.
we move, and if we're comfortable more or less at this point, we can shift gears. And so that's the ground out of which we can look at Zen in North America, and where's it going to go. I'll just throw out just the radical democratized version that I Michael's soapbox, and that is that what I would like to see, in my dream universe is that we shift the focus that we create congregations, that our institutional concern be the creation of Dharma cultures in which we raise our children, in which we hold ourselves accountable, whether we meditate or not. And that specialists in the practice become the institutional leaders of these congregations, and become professional. The specialists become the leaders of these communities. That it would mean that we all say, oh, okay, I'll go out and start a congregation. I'll have a Sunday worship service, and it'll feature a sermon, and we will experiment with what it means to create a community that attracts people who find the message healing, but are not going to take up the Zendo practice in large numbers. Evangelize the good news of Buddhism in a more ekayana kind of sense. This is like ekayana, the one dharma kind of thing. Now, this is my fantasy, and I won't inflict it on you for very long. But and then that it's supported by schools of practice. So places like Kasapara, they're Dharma Ring. We have training centers, and they produce the leaders of these communities, and there are, and with that there would be educational requirements as well as meditation. It would look a little bit more like Japanese Rinzai and Soto, where most people become, except to serve our cultural standards rather than Japanese temple, which has more to do with periodic ceremonies and funerals, that this would be adjusted to our specific community needs.
Why do I suddenly think this is the Christian model? Yes.
Well, the model, what inspired me to this is, are people familiar with the Buddhist churches in America? Yeah, the BCA. And I thought that was a brilliant scheme, and it was the worm in it, which was, I should say, one of the larger sects of the Pure Land in Japan in the period just ahead of the Second World War, decided to Americanize, or as one dissertation I saw in the Far Lancet Library, the Protestantize of an American Buddhist sect. And for a while, it really worked. It was really interesting. They called their temples churches, they called their priests ministers. They had the only accredited seminary for years and years and years, using a Western training model, except it was a little bit more like a rabbinical model, because you went and trained for a period of time at the seminary, and then you had to go to Japan for a year, and then come back and finish your training. It was like a four-year program. And at their peak, they were maybe 200,000. Their numbers are not like real, because they went into a precipitous decline.
And so did these minister to then a Chinese community within
Japanese
community within North America?
And this was, I think there were two things that went wrong in their community. One was ethnocentrism. I'm trying not to use the word racism. People, non-Japanese started coming to their churches. They loved it right up until the magic number. And the magic number for integration of religious communities in North America appears to be 20%. When a minority racial community joins another ethnic or racial grouping, in most cases, they're welcome until 20%. And then at that point, they start saying they're trying to take over. Yeah. And then all sorts of subtle and not so subtle things happen. And as I've studied, race in American religion, one observer said there is no such thing as an integrated church. Churches, religious communities are either integrating or segregating. It's a dynamic.
We have a church like that in my community in Monterey, and it appears,
BCA.
Yeah, it appears to be that this is integrating. I go to events like Oban Festival, where Anglo children are included in the dancing and are actually being taught, and that flower arranging and various other traditional arts are being disseminated within the community. I don't know how healthy that community is. I'm not a part of it.
There are signs that they might, if they haven't. My guesstimate is there's 20 to 30,000. I think that's still a critical mass. I believe they can still.
And also, these people also represent those who were interned. That generation is now dying off, but they have this very tight historical memory. That I think plays a part.
It absolutely did. There was also, I think, the other big mistake that they dealt with from where I stand was there was a period when they were really enforcing theological purity. There were a lot of Zen people who were attracted to them, and Zen and Shin, it's like peanut butter and jelly, really. I mean, in China, you can't tell that, you can't unpack the difference between Pure Land and Zen Dharma. Although you can get, Haku and Ikaku wrote some very harsh things about Shin as well. Yeah. But it's a constant. It was interesting when these people were coming in, who started with Zen, who were willing to have a broader perspective, who were told, no, you can't do that. That's not the current bishop, but the bishop just of the denomination just passed this was a close friend of Shunder's and there's a lot of opening. Like I say, the question is, are they gonna so that is in the back of my head, and I'm interested in something that's open to other things, but is driven by Zen rather than by Shin. And this is not fantasy. And I call it congregationalism.
Well, I think the part of it, we did our Shogaku Zen Institute at one of these Buddhist churches in America, and the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley. And they're, losing population. And I've also been to the church in Fresno and we were taught there. And part of you know, the old school, there were no women. All the women are doing the sushi or doing something in the kitchen, and it's only the men who are teaching, even in the Caucasians who come. So when the men come and they talk about or Shinran, it's pure doctrine, and everybody goes to sleep in the audience. They give this intense doctrinal talk, and so in Fresno it's mostly Japanese, because in the valley there are a lot of Japanese people around.
But actual Japanese,
Yeah.
not Americans.
Yeah, both, both, and the next generation is not interested.
And they tend to become Methodists.
Yeah. But the important thing, I think, in this model, and that they're doing in Dharma is Dharma school.
Right.
We need to do something for the children, or otherwise, you know, when are they going to come and be exposed?
If we don't educate our children, somebody else will.
That's right. And not only will somebody else will, but all three of my grandchildren on the West Coast are in Hebrew day school. And they teach them yoga. And they teach them to meditate. And when they go to the Unitarian Church, they have their Unitarian Buddhist congregation. And so it's all being subsumed. So there's no need to go to Buddhist. So from early on, they learned, well, my religion has it all. You know, the Jewish religion has yoga, it has meditation, and therefore I don't need to go there. So this is how we're being phased out.
And the Unitarians have been the great. I mean, you know, that was I wrote a paper 20 years ago called "An Invitation to Western Buddhists." You need a place to raise your kids. Come on in the water spot.
Yeah, but they become UU.
But they become UUs. I mean, they become UUs with Buddhist sensibilities. And I think there should be, I think there could be a network of congregations. I think our Marine flirts with that. Never, you know, there's the Toledo Buddhist Temple flirts with it. You know, having a very large religious education. It turns on the religious education.
Another thing is that not everybody wants a deep committed practice and a pathway to ordination. Some people, and we might tend to disparage what they are looking for, and we only encourage people who want, the kind of practice that we have pursued ourselves. And I think that is depriving people of a resource. But how to do that? I mean, because our whole trajectory has been towards this deeply committed practice, towards transmission and so forth. And so, what do we have to offer to people who don't want that, but they really do want something that informs how they participate in their lives and how they relate to other people and things like that.
Even if they only meditate for 5 minutes several times a week.
Right. Right. Yeah. Or
So,
if they just come to hear an inspirational talk about the Dharma, and maybe they treat somebody in their life a little bit better because of it. I think I would somehow like to see that kind of the offered
That's
church.
what you're talking about. The Buddhist sensibility without the sort of monastic value.
Yeah.
Right. Well, Kevin Sin's a whole different thing. He's really interesting in that he took the Anukasaka Sutta, pulled all Buddhist terminology out, substituted Western psychological language, and packaged insight meditation as a secular practice, a secular discipline, and wildly successful. I mean, it's interesting how the medical community has adapted to it, partially because it's amenable to testing. Insight meditation does make qualitative shifts in consciousness that can be tracked, and fascinating. That whole actually, when I was listening to Diana, I was thinking one of that as Buddhism has transmitted itself to other cultures, it has always entered into dialogue with the indigenous religions. Starting with, your gods are cool, did you know they protect Buddhism? And then getting more serious, you know, I mean, and Zen, we are the product of the, you know, I mean, there are those who say that, you know, that we're the love child of Buddhism and Taoism. Zen coming to Europe and specifically North America, while there is some very interesting and juicy interreligious dialogue, the dialogue that has really been dominant has been with psychology. And when I was listening to Diana, I was hearing this fascinating, almost pure Jungian vocabulary to explain classic environment, you know, and it was fascinating. That was very rich, and it reframes it too. I mean, you know, it will be what we present will look a lot different than, or what we transmit will look a lot different than what first arrived, as has always been the case. The Dharma is enormously mutable as it pushes us into our deepest realizations of who we are. It can work with any language. I mean, yeah.
If we're able to school children, we'll see something very different, I think, because in the boomer generation, we all are iconoclasts. We have all moved from something that we inherited from our original heritage, and so there's also that flavor. I mean, we don't tolerate authority very well, and we have disintegrated from something, and so trying to form something, you know, lasting out of that is a very tricky thing to try to do.
It's been very tricky, and who knows where we'll, you know, what to think. So I don't want to overly move into the fantasy world of James, because then we can also, I hope, have a little bit of time to look at what's actually happening. And because, as I said, really, that model of congregational Zen has not is not popped up anywhere. Little bits and pieces of it so far.
Have you sort of given your spiel on authority yet? I mean, the whole topic.
Well, the whole
I mean,
first part
yeah.
was laying out the ground.
Yeah.
My core thesis of this was that a rigid understanding of authority as being one teacher is a myth in all senses of the word, in a good sense and in the sense of not being factually true, and that that it represents something powerful and good, and that we have the college of practice now. We have multiple hundreds of people who have authorizations in historic lineages, and nobody now has to study with one person or their thought. You can, well, or
That's his opinion.
That's
His
yeah.
opinion.
Yeah. And well, I mean, just as I think it's more than an opinion. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of teachers, and then we have to make our own judgments about.
But we still have
whether somebody
lineages
is-
that may say you have to stay with one teacher or your thought.
Well, yeah,
We still have that.
100 flowers.
Yeah.
You know,
They're
and
not saying 100 flowers.
Well,
That's what
They're saying
Yeah.
99 weeds in one flower.
well, absolutely. I mean, and there's something there. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I mean, that, I don't know who you're referring to, but I've never heard anyone say that, actually. That the other people are wrong and I'm right. I've never heard anyone say that.
That's interesting. That has not been my experience.
Not mine.
Okay.
Yeah. And there are multiple hundreds of teachers. That is a fact on the ground. And we have choices. And people are experimenting. There are all sorts of styles emerging at this point. And the juice appears to be going to the groups that are trying to be a little flatter.
When you say
that
Jews,
is-
the population?
well, that people are attracted to.
Did you say flatter?
Yeah, what do you mean?
Flatter. So we start looking at, right,
Flat
not
egalitarian.
flattery. So,
Horizontal.
right, I think quantum provides the most interesting model, and it's intriguing because we have nobody from the quantum here. And partially because the whole concept of priest as the Japanese, the Japanese model of bodhisattva ordination is unique to the Japanese transmission. On continental Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese Buddhism, you're a monastic, by which we mean Vinaya monastic, or you're a layperson. And this priestly training model is unique to the Japanese inheritance. And therefore, I think Shogaku Institute just is not packaged in a way that would necessarily bring people from quantum, but it could. It could be
Yeah,
useful.
well, we're
to
barely
them.
beginning to bring in people from other than Soto and even other than Suzuki Roshi. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
really just
Yeah.
beginning.
Yeah.
But I
Right.
think we also have to look at the racist tendencies between Korea and Japan, which have not been friends historically.
Yeah,
In America, we're
right.
friends, but those
Right.
traditions are not friendly to each other
And
at
even,
all.
right, well, it's true, and Koreans can be quite sensitive about it. And I've witnessed, when I was in seminary, one of the great blessings of that experience with Masao Abe was in residence for 2 years while I was there. And I took everything that he offered. I loved it. Although I did mention he was a horrible lecturer. I mean, the classroom thing was dreadful. We would come in small seminars. He would open up one of his books and he would lean in and he would read it. And that was the lecture. Where it became alive was that in the papers, he would just take it apart and analyze it. And I mean, it was like, I couldn't believe the classes were not large, but the amount of time he devoted to each person was phenomenal.
And what does he have to do with the Korean?
So, a Korean national doctoral student came into one of the classes 5 minutes late. And he looked at him, he said, Korean time. And went in, that's all.
Yeah, so
That
it's
was
just,
enough.
and it's not just the Koreans who don't like the Japanese, it's the Japanese who left the Koreans out of the lineage.
Yeah.
When the first Buddhists in Japan were Koreans, not Chinese. And the way they look down at the Koreans is phenomenal. So we
So-
have a long way to go.
And and hopefully we can get past most of that and here's one spot where we can look at the quantum school and learn some really valuable things.
Well, so now we're talking horizontal models. I'd love to
Right.
hear.
Then we're going to do the horizontal models. Or what the previous, my fantasy universe was democratization. My congregational thing is seeing an ultimately flat thing. Zen, I think, requires a lateral, this vertical ordinance. There is somebody who has something to teach, and there are people who want to learn. And so how do we deal with that in our cultural context? And what the quantum school does is just a fascinating experiment. And it turns on the personality of another brilliant and flawed person. He had his scandals too, but he also created a fascinating institution. And what he does, while he has, I've already alluded to the two-tier transmission and how he requires people to be confirmed by multiple teachers, even though one person signs the document. What's more interesting to me is how he also started acknowledging people as for their gifts and at less than transmission. So you didn't have to stand in the lineage in order to contribute. And specifically, he created two positions, Dharma teacher and senior Dharma teacher. I love that those are the titles that are used for retired abbots at the San Francisco Seminary. Now, when he first began, it was simply, you've shown up for a week. You know, you're a Dharma teacher, and in their system, they use varieties of vows. You get 5, then you get 10, 8, then you get 10, and then you go up to the Brahmajala, 68, whatever apparently the number is on the Brahmajala vows, and or you become a Buddha. And with increasing responsibilities, at least through the first 3 sets, and what and I love that they use the word teacher, because they use the word teacher for somebody who knows how to set up the Zendo. And for me, it punctures the title, it deflates it a little bit, it devalorizes it, and at the same time, it upholds the basic wisdom of human beings. And so originally, a Dharma teacher had to be, show up for a week. Today, it's a rather elaborate process. It takes, I think you have to be around for at least 3 years. You have to undergo a formal course of instruction, and that happens with, as time goes on and you have institutions. They have several, in actual raw numbers of people who say they are Zen practitioners. If you parse out the Thich Nhat Hanh people, who I don't actually consider a Zen community, they're their own unique thing. The quantum school and the people in the San Francisco Suzuki Roshi lineage contend with each other for being the sheer numbers of practitioners. And because of the historical accidents that Shunryu Suzuki's people tend to stay close to home, that it tended to be almost like a denomination in the Bay Area. And Sun San, scattered the seeds across the globe. He doesn't love to start centers and then move on. So they're spread quite a bit more.
Are you going to go on to that model?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the senior Dharma teacher is another, is the next level up. Again, initially it was simply it didn't require a great deal of time. You had to be around a while, a few years, and and it meant that you could give some, you might even be able to do interviews, but you would do koans, or they call them konans, but you could talk with people about their practice, based upon your own experience and under close supervision. Again, over time, it has become more, I don't want to say ossified, but it's more deeply structured. It requires much longer. I think you've been practicing for a decade now in order to become a senior Dharma teacher.
So it drifted that way. It drifted into taking longer to get these. They kept the names of
Right.
these categories, but it took you longer to get them.
It's a natural progression as
For
an
us
organization.
too. It has happened for us, hasn't it?
As organizations mature, you need to
That
do
structure
this.
used to be something, and I
Yeah.
moved longer.
So in my own community, Boundless Way community, which is a network of, I don't even know how many seniors we are now, a dozen, something like that. We're mainly New England, and now we have a tiny handful in Ohio. And we just plain out stolen the concept. And we have practice leaders, Dharma teachers, senior Dharma teachers, but we're at the front end, and so we don't have a heavily, our requirements are not as light as some songs were at the very beginning, but they're nowhere near as rigid as they.
It's kind of by need, right?
It
We
fills
need
needs.
we need someone else to do gospel instruction. Who do you think would be good?
Right.
Better versus now, gee,
Yeah.
this person's been here 12 years, don't you think we ought to let them do gospel instruction?
Precisely, and that is the shift in attitude, and
And
it's.
it comes from the sonder, or from the
Well, generally speaking, it's still hierarchical. The decisions about spiritual direction come from a broader pool, not one person, but a broader pool of people who are teachers. And we've made, at least in a balanced way, I can say there's a strong line between our financial governance and spiritual direction.
there's a strong line.
Strong line between.
Line, oh, yes.
So the board is, has complete control of the finances, but the spiritual direction is in the hands of the teachers who operate as a college. So the one task in our community that people volunteer for is practice leaders. And practice leaders, if it's a larger group, those are people who take responsibility for one, like an evening practice period. They're the ones who will show up, make sure the doors open, make sure the bells are rung, and it's very rudimentary. And for us, we want somebody who's been around 3-4 years. We know they actually show up. We're not looking for insight, we're looking for commitment.
And is there any ceremonial investiture?
Well, it's interesting. It seems to be growing. It started from just saying, "Will you be?" to now we have a ceremonial acknowledgement where the teachers, at our annual meeting, the teachers bow to the new people who fill these positions.
Do they take vows?
They do not in our community. In the Myoun school, which has this more sophisticated model, yes, they take vows. Their precept, they have this staging of precepts, and they attach these offices to those vows. For me, the point is that we can do any darn thing we want. But I consider this, the difference is that philosophically is that this is not democratization, this is distribution of power. And it can happen because we don't have to believe the teacher is the sole transmitted teacher is the only source of wisdom. But we are, and without denying that in our tradition, transmitted teachers are the carriers of the tradition.
And the top dogs.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, and hopefully less dog,
Less dog behavior.
Yeah.
But show our checks and balances somehow.
So there's more of, well, at least there's distribution, and there accountability arises in the community because I think it's hard to find a community now that doesn't have a written ethics code, and hopefully some way to operationalize it. I think that's going to be the next big thing as we go forward.
What about succession?
So succession. So these titles of practice leader, Dharma teacher, senior Dharma teacher are not seen as transmission, and it says in numerous places these are appointments for as long as it seems appropriate. No doubt, I know in Myoun school that people who've had various of these titles have set themselves up, as autonomous teachers. None of them have taken root and become anything. That has not yet happened with us, but we're a baby, we're only a decade old, so we'll have our interesting experiences as well, no doubt.
One of the things that occurs to me about the distribution of power is that a teacher needs to develop, to have confidence in his or her methods and see that taking root in the students before even you can consider that. And we're all kind of like Topsy, we're growing ourselves. So without a system that teaches us how to teach, how to recognize our methodology, what our methodology is, how we can check off, okay, my students now are responsible. We're all learning that from scratch. So this is why the distribution of power takes so long, because a teacher has to first learn how to teach in these traditions.
And in our communities in the West, it's entirely tutorial. I mean, it's the term discipleship. If you're working with a teacher, the academic side of it. That in Japan, you can go to
You're going to university.
You go to university nowadays.
Yeah.
And
but even when you're working one-to-one with the teacher is teaching you, ritual perhaps, history perhaps, going over Dogen perhaps when you're getting ready for transmission, but they're not teaching you how to teach.
Right. Well, the other thing is for many of us, we're starting so late in our lives. And so by the time we have a clue, we're dead.
Yeah, almost.
sort of happens.
You're almost
I'm
there.
not talking about, that's,
Yeah, but we have limited resources
Yeah.
by the time because of the way we've started, so.
Yeah, I mean, but we're not in it just for ourselves. We're here for the larger sangha and for those who are coming after.
well, I'm saying that on behalf of the larger sangha because, I mean, so it takes us, 20 years to get to start to have a clue. And that's tough on the larger sangha because by the time you start to have a clue, you're starting
On the
down
down
to
the
percent.
It's
Yeah.
true. Yeah,
And,
it
and,
is true.
so, I mean, thank goodness, at least we have a couple kids here that, like,
Yeah, we're very happy to see them.
get a little head start, be able to be
Well,
longer,
yeah.
course of wisdom over a whole life.
But even those of us who started very young, because of the system itself, not being a university system where you could go in and get courses on how to do this, it has taken us a very long time. Even though I started in my 20s, you started. How old were you? 26. Yeah, but by the time, but by the time we get there, because of the methods of training, we don't, it takes us a long time to get
Well,
there.
and that opens up all sorts of interesting questions around support and for many of us, the options are perpetual poverty or it's a dual track, or there's a day job, and that's kind of it. Those are the choices,
And we went over that with Lou, that the different, the therapist healer model for the priest, and the scholars. So,
Yeah, there are a handful of jobs that seem to be pretty good for, but we have to adapt our training methods in order to encourage it. So already internally within the Soto community, there's an enormous debate going on around residential retreat environments,
Thus we have her.
yeah.
then we've heard somebody was on that committee.
Well, and it's fascinating and it's important. I mean, the decision will affect perpetuating this model, or trying to find something, or positing alternatives. And,
Yeah.
we'll see.
The 30 days of this training was because of the SCBA maybe adapting 3 30-day residentials instead of the ongo of 90 days that was going to be required.
And I'm in the camp that says 90 days is both way too much on an individual and nowhere near enough training.
Yeah,
So,
it has to be ongoing,
yeah.
lots of little trainings.
Because I've sat on the membership committee for the ACTA, the Americans in Teachers Association, for a few years now, I just started looking at what people's applications say about how long they trained before they became teachers, and I find that population really fascinating, the Americans in Teachers, because no one, or very few, we must be able to find an exception, almost nobody who is a teacher in the ACTA would be a teacher in another lineage of the ACTA. The training requirements are so wildly different, right? So what holds these people, what can be recognized across the traditions? How can, you look at something and say,
requirement or whatever.
and it appears to be two things. And one is some kind of recognized acknowledgement, some transmission is too strong a word.
From a higher up translated to a.
Yeah, a traditional authorization. So Oshos from the Rin, Rinzaiji would be any Osho from Rinzaiji, because it appears there's like two tiers of Osho, and like in the Edo Shimano lineage, you got to be the second tier of Osho. But we've established to our satisfaction as the committee that Sasaki Roshi meant for his Oshos to be the second tier of Osho. They can make Oshos. So that's in Kwanum school, you need to be at least a Jidahosini, which is you can't transmit, but you can, So anyway, it's not necessarily direct transmission, but it is a clear authorization within the lineage in which you stand.
That's cool, yeah.
Right. The other not criteria, but the other mark of all the people who are members of the ACTA is they've sat at least 300 days of retreat. So in an Ango or a Kese, that would be the Sesshin parts of those. And most have sat between 500 and 700 before they were in a teacher, and a few a lot more than that. The junkies. So, what I've proposed at SZBA as a requirement is 1 year of sitting, 365 days.
Including 90-day ongo would be.
Well, a 90-day ongo would only count for the session parts. Yeah, it would
So
not.
it would be 90 days.
No 90-day requirements is my.
But in yours, how many times 90 days?
Huh?
365 days of session.
But if you went to a 90-day, you wouldn't get 90 days.
No, you go to a 90-day, you
Get
go and get
7,
about,
3,
yeah, you get,
15,
right,
21 or
whatever it is. Yeah, I think 21, if you do a 5-day or 7-day every month for a 90-day, 100-day, you get a little more. But
What was the first? There were two criteria on this.
that was, so the first one is an authorization.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So a generally acceptable authorization across peers. And the second is, now we're debating whether there's going to be a third requirement, but that's simply signing off on it. It probably it will be, what will be presented probably is among a committee has been charged to come up with questions of whether we want to be a professional organization or something less than that, but more than simply an affinity group. And my gut is that, and I'm on the committee that's charged to bring back, 2 or 3 proposals. My gut is that the only thing that stands a snowball's chance of actually passing would be an ethics code, that you have to have an ethics code with an operational enforcement. And if you belong to too small a group, well, here's the code. That might pass. I doubt it. Anything else, but, because the ACTA is just
The Wild West.
well, it's a support group, that has accidentally become a credentialing body. And doesn't like it, doesn't want to do that. And plus,
We need to come to a close and talk about dinner.
are there any burning things that?
There was something earlier on, just one quick question, with Kazon's transmission to learn.
Yeah.
Would you say that, I'm curious to do some research on biographies, and do you think they're pretty accurate, or in terms of history?
Well, they're accurate. They're hagiographies. But you're dealing with hagiographies. It doesn't matter which, what your source is. Kazon's a beautiful writer. And as a koan person, even in the Indian transmission part, the poems he attaches are exquisite and go right to the heart. He really has an amazing eye, and I'm proud he's an ancestor of ours.
Okay, so, thank you.